The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I stared at the unknown number flashing on my screen. My apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant sounds of holiday celebrations from neighboring units. Everyone else was with their families. Everyone else was wanted somewhere. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Deputy Director Williams? The voice was crisp, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. I hadn't been called by that title in 3 years. Not since I'd walked away from everything I'd built at Langley. Not since my parents made it clear that my career choices had made me unwelcome at their Christmas table. My name is Sarah Williams, and until that phone call, I thought my story was over. I was 34 years old, sitting alone in a studio apartment in Arlington, Virginia, watching reruns of old movies while the rest of the world celebrated Christmas with people who actually wanted them there. The apartment was sparse, just the essentials: a fold-out couch, a small table, a few books on intelligence analysis that I couldn't bring myself to donate. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of my graduation from the CIA's career training program, back when I still believed that serving my country would make my parents proud. 3 days earlier, I'd received the text message that had become an annual tradition. From my mother, Margaret Williams, sent from their home in Westchester County. "Sarah, your father and I have discussed it, and we think it's best if you don't come for Christmas this year. Uncle Robert will be here with his family, and you know how he feels about your profession. We don't want any uncomfortable situations. Maybe next year will be different. Uncle Robert." My father's brother, a federal judge who'd made his opinions about intelligence work abundantly clear at every family gathering. Government spies, he'd called us. People who lie for a living. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who'd spent his career in federal service looked down on those who served in the shadows. My parents had never understood my choice to join the CIA. When I'd announced my acceptance into the training program 12 years ago, fresh out of Georgetown with a degree in international relations, my mother had actually cried. Not tears of pride, but tears of what she called disappointment and worry. "Why can't you do something normal?" she'd asked. "Work for the State Department if you want to serve the country. Or become a teacher. Your cousin Jennifer is a teacher, and she's so fulfilled." My father had been quieter about his disapproval, but it was there in every strained conversation, every deflection, when his golf buddies asked what his daughter did for work. "She works for the government," he'd say, as if that explained everything and nothing at the same time. The first few years hadn't been so bad. I'd been assigned to the Directorate of Analysis, working on economic intelligence reports about emerging markets. It was desk work, safe work, the kind of thing that maybe my parents could eventually understand. I'd won commendations for my work on predicting currency fluctuations in Southeast Asia. I'd briefed senior officials on trade implications of political instability in developing nations. But then came the promotion to the Directorate of Operations. Fieldwork. The kind of assignment that required cover stories and careful explanations about why I couldn't always say where I was going or what I was doing. The kind of work that made family dinners increasingly tense as the gaps in my stories became more obvious. I'd spent 2 years in Berlin, officially working as a cultural attaché at the embassy, actually running assets and gathering intelligence on Russian activities in Eastern Europe. It was challenging work, important work, and I'd been good at it. Good enough to earn another promotion, this time to Deputy Director of the European Division. That's when everything fell apart. The operation in Prague had been routine, a simple intelligence exchange with a Czech contact who'd been providing information about arms trafficking through the region. But intelligence work is never really routine, and what should have been a straightforward meeting became an international incident when our contact was compromised. The details were still classified, but the outcome was public enough. 3 people dead, including an American diplomat, and a diplomatic crisis that took months to resolve. The investigation cleared me of any operational failures, but in the intelligence community, being cleared and being trusted are 2 different things. My parents had seen the news reports. Not the full story, of course, that would never be public, but enough to understand that their daughter had been involved in something that had gone very wrong. The phone call from my mother came 2 days after the story broke. "Sarah, we need to talk about your career choices," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I'd learned to recognize. "This isn't the life we wanted for you. This isn't the life we can support." My father had been more direct. "Maybe it's time you found a different line of work. Something that doesn't put you in these situations." The pressure had been building for months. Every family gathering became an interrogation about my plans to leave the agency. Every conversation with my parents ended with subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, suggestions that I consider a career change. My mother would send me job listings for positions with think tanks and consulting firms. My father would mention friends who were looking for someone with my background for their corporate security departments. The final straw came during a family dinner in September. Uncle Robert had made another comment about government agents who think they're above the law, and when I'd tried to explain that intelligence work was about protecting American interests, he'd laughed. "Protecting American interests by getting people killed?" he'd asked. "By creating international incidents? Maybe you should consider whether you're really helping anyone." My father hadn't defended me. My mother had changed the subject to my cousin Jennifer's recent promotion at her elementary school. I'd excused myself and left, and we hadn't spoken properly since. 2 weeks later, I'd submitted my resignation from the CIA. The decision had been building for months, but in the end, it felt sudden. I'd walked into Deputy Director Harrison's office on a Tuesday morning and placed my resignation letter on his desk. He'd read it slowly, then looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested he'd been expecting this moment. "You're one of our best analysts," he'd said. "And despite what happened in Prague, you're still one of our most effective case officers. Are you sure this is what you want?" I'd been sure, or I'd thought I was sure. The weight of family disappointment, the stress of the investigation, the constant pressure to defend my career choices. It had all become too much. "I need to find something else," I'd told him. "Something that doesn't require me to choose between my work and my family." He'd accepted my resignation, but not before making an offer. "If you ever change your mind, there's always a place for you here. Good intelligence officers are rare, and officers with your skills are even rarer." That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of working as a security consultant for private firms, analyzing threats and writing reports that felt important but never quite matched the significance of the work I'd left behind. 3 years of trying to rebuild relationships with parents who seemed relieved that I'd finally chosen a normal career. Except it hadn't worked. The distance between my parents and me had only grown wider. My mother still introduced me to her friends as my daughter, the security consultant, but there was something hollow about it. And my father, who'd wanted me to find safer work, now seemed uncomfortable with the fact that I was analyzing threats for corporate clients rather than serving my country. The text message about Christmas had been the latest confirmation that nothing I did would ever be enough. I'd left the job they disapproved of, I'd found work they could understand and explain to their friends, but I still wasn't welcome at their Christmas table, because Uncle Robert might be uncomfortable. So here I was, spending Christmas Eve alone in an apartment that felt more like a temporary shelter than a home, watching old movies and trying not to think about the career I'd abandoned or the family relationships I'd failed to save. That's when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unexpected. "Deputy Director Williams? This is Director Patricia Coleman. I apologize for calling so late, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Director Coleman. I knew the name. She'd been appointed CIA Director 18 months ago after a career that had taken her from field operations to the highest levels of the intelligence community. I'd never met her personally, but her reputation was formidable. "Director Coleman, I think there's been a mistake," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I haven't been Deputy Director Williams for 3 years. I resigned from the agency. I'm aware of your resignation, Sarah. I'm also aware that your security clearance was never officially terminated, and that your access to certain operational databases was maintained at the discretion of the previous administration. What I need to know is whether you're willing to listen to what I have to say." The silence stretched between us. Outside my window, I could see the lights of other apartments, other lives, other people who were probably having normal Christmas Eve conversations with their families. "I'm listening," I said finally. "Good. Sarah, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Are you somewhere secure where we can speak freely? I looked around my small apartment. It was hardly a secure facility, but it was private. Yes. 3 hours ago, our station chief in Moscow went dark. Agent David Chen was conducting a routine intelligence gathering operation when his communications stopped. Our last signal intelligence suggests he may have been compromised. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The familiar weight of operational responsibility settled over me like a heavy coat. Moscow Station was one of our most critical posts, and losing contact with the station chief was never routine. What does this have to do with me? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand. Agent Chen was your protege during his time in the European division. You trained him, you mentored him, and according to his personnel file, you're one of the few people who knows his operational methods well enough to predict his actions in a crisis situation. David Chen, I remembered him clearly. A brilliant analyst who'd transitioned to operations, ambitious and careful in equal measure. I'd recommended him for the Moscow assignment myself, back when I still had the authority to make such recommendations. Sarah, I need someone who can help us understand what Chen might have done when he realized he was compromised. I need someone who knows his training, his instincts, his protocols. I need someone who can help us figure out whether he's still alive and how we might be able to extract him. Director Coleman, I appreciate the confidence, but I've been out of operations for 3 years. There are active officers who don't know Chen the way you do. And there are active officers who don't have your specific experience with Russian intelligence operations. Sarah, I wouldn't be calling you on Christmas Eve if this weren't critical. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, families were celebrating Christmas together. Somewhere else, an intelligence officer I'd trained was possibly fighting for his life in Moscow. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to come in, tonight. I'm asking you to look at the intelligence we have and help us develop a plan to bring David Chen home. I'm asking you to remember that you're one of the best intelligence officers this agency has ever had, and that sometimes the work chooses you rather than the other way around. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. 3 years ago, I'd walked away from this life because it had cost me my family relationships. Now my family had made it clear that even walking away wasn't enough to earn their acceptance. Sarah? Director Coleman's voice was gentle but urgent. I need an answer. I closed my eyes and thought about David Chen. Somewhere in Moscow, possibly compromised, possibly in danger. I thought about the skills I'd developed over more than a decade of service, skills that were being wasted on corporate security reports. I thought about my parents, who would never understand this choice, and Uncle Robert, who would see it as confirmation of everything he'd believed about my character. Then I thought about the oath I'd taken when I'd first joined the agency, the commitment to protect and serve that had driven me to this career in the first place. I'll be there in an hour, I said. The CIA headquarters in Langley looked different at midnight on Christmas Eve. The usual bustle of daytime operations had given way to skeleton crews and the quiet hum of essential systems. Security was tighter than I remembered. Additional checkpoints, biometric scanners, and guards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Christmas Eve. My temporary badge read Consultant, Special Operations, and the looks I received from the duty officers suggested they knew exactly who I was and why I was there. Word travels fast in the intelligence community, especially when a former deputy director returns after a 3-year absence. Director Coleman met me at the elevator on the 7th floor. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd earned her position through capability rather than politics. Her handshake was firm, her expression serious but not unfriendly. Sarah, thank you for coming. I know this isn't how you plan to spend Christmas Eve. Neither is losing a station chief, I replied. What's the current situation? She led me down familiar corridors toward the operations center. The walls were lined with photographs of CIA directors past and present, and I noticed my own photo was missing from the deputy director's gallery. They'd probably removed it after my resignation. David Chen missed his scheduled communication window at 1,400 hours Moscow time. His cover was as a trade attaché at the embassy, but he was actually running a network of assets focused on Russian military intelligence. His last confirmed location was a cafe in central Moscow, where he was meeting with a contact codenamed Blackbird. We passed through multiple security doors, each requiring Coleman's badge and biometric confirmation. The operations center was a hive of activity despite the late hour. Analysts hunched over computers, communications specialists monitoring radio frequencies, and a large display showing real-time intelligence updates from around the world. Blackbird is a mid-level officer in the GRU, Coleman continued. He's been providing intelligence about Russian military activities in Eastern Europe for 18 months. Reliable, careful, and according to Chen's reports, increasingly nervous about his safety. She led me to a conference room where files were spread across a large table. The familiar sight of classified documents and operational reports brought back memories of countless briefings and strategy sessions. This was the work I'd missed more than I'd admitted to myself. "Show me everything," I said. The intelligence painted a troubling picture. Chen had been in Moscow for 8 months, building a network of assets and gathering information about Russian military modernization programs. His work had been productive. Too productive, perhaps. In the past month alone, he'd provided intelligence about new weapons systems, troop movements near the Ukrainian border, and internal discussions about Russian strategy in the Arctic. He was supposed to meet Blackbird at Café Pushkin at 1300 hours, Coleman explained. The meeting was routine, a quarterly intelligence exchange disguised as a social lunch between embassy colleagues. But surveillance footage shows Chen arriving at the cafe and then leaving abruptly after just 10 minutes. I studied the surveillance photographs. Chen looked tense, checking his surroundings more frequently than a casual embassy worker would. His body language suggested he'd detected something wrong. "What about Blackbird?" I asked. "Never showed up. And when our Moscow station tried to reach him through back channels, they discovered he'd been arrested 3 days ago on charges of espionage. It was kept quiet, no media reports, no official announcements." The implications were clear. If Blackbird had been compromised, there was a good chance Chen's cover had been blown as well. The meeting at Café Pushkin could have been a trap. "Has anyone tried to contact Chen through emergency protocols?" Coleman nodded toward a communications specialist who'd been monitoring radio frequencies. "Agent Martinez has been trying to reach him every hour since he went dark. No response on any of his emergency channels." Agent Martinez looked up from her equipment. "His personal communication device is either turned off or destroyed. His embassy phone hasn't been used since yesterday morning. And the tracking beacon in his diplomatic vehicle shows it's been parked at the embassy compound since 1100 hours." I reviewed Chen's operational history and psychological profile. He'd been one of my most promising trainees, analytical, cautious, and excellent at reading situations. If he'd detected surveillance at the cafe, he would have followed protocol, abort the meeting, return to safe territory, and contact his handlers. "Unless he couldn't return to safe territory," I said aloud. Coleman leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Chen would never simply disappear without communication unless he had no choice. If he left the cafe abruptly, it's because he spotted surveillance. But if he hasn't contacted the embassy, it means he believes the embassy is compromised too." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Chen suspected the embassy was being watched, he would have gone to ground, using skills I'd taught him about operating in hostile territory without official support. "There's something else," Coleman said quietly. 2 hours ago, we received intelligence that the FSB has been conducting a major counterintelligence operation in Moscow. They've been watching several Western embassies, including ours. It's possible Chen detected their surveillance and realized his cover was blown. I studied the map of Moscow spread across the table. Red pins marked known FSB surveillance posts, blue pins showed the locations of Chen's regular activities, and green pins indicated potential safe houses and emergency meeting points. "David is smart," I said, "too smart to walk into a trap without an exit strategy. When I trained him, I taught him to think 3 moves ahead, to always have contingency plans. If he suspected he was compromised, he would have activated one of his emergency protocols." "Which protocols?" Coleman asked. I traced my finger across the map. identifying locations that Chen would have memorized during his operational training. Every deep cover operative has a series of dead drops, places where they can leave messages or retrieve emergency supplies without making direct contact with handlers. Chen would have established these within his first month in Moscow. Agent Martinez looked up from her communications equipment. We've checked the primary dead drops. No activity. What about the secondary sites, I asked. The ones that aren't in his official operational plan. Coleman frowned. What secondary sites? I realized I'd stumbled onto something that might not be in Chen's official files. During training, I always taught my operatives to establish personal emergency protocols, backup plans that weren't documented in official channels. It's a safety measure in case their primary protocols are compromised. You taught them to operate outside official channels? There was a note of concern in Coleman's voice. I taught them to survive. In hostile territory, sometimes official channels aren't safe. I taught them to think like ghosts, to have resources and options that couldn't be traced back to the agency. I pulled out a photograph of Chen from his personnel file. He was younger in the picture, taken during his training at the farm. I remembered him as eager, intelligent, and surprisingly good at thinking unconventionally. David would have established a personal emergency network, I continued. Local contacts who aren't connected to his official cover, safe houses that aren't on any CIA database, communication methods that don't depend on embassy resources. Coleman was quiet for a moment. How do we find this network? We think like David. We analyze his behavior patterns, his psychological profile, his training. We figure out where he would go and what he would do if he believed his entire official support structure was compromised. I spent the next hour reviewing every detail of Chen's operational history. His cover identity as a trade attaché had given him access to Moscow's business community. His official duties had required him to attend cultural events, trade conferences, and diplomatic receptions. But buried in his activity reports were patterns that suggested he'd been building relationships beyond his official requirements. Here, I said, pointing to a series of entries in his weekly reports. He mentions attending a weekly chess club at a community center in the Arbat district. That's not something a busy trade attaché would do for professional reasons. Agent Martinez cross-referenced the location with Moscow City records. The Arbat Chess Club meets every Thursday evening. It's run by a retired mathematics professor named Viktor Petrov. Chess players, I said. Perfect cover for quiet conversations and building personal relationships. David would have been cultivating contacts there. Not intelligence assets, but ordinary people who might help him if he needed to disappear. Coleman studied the intelligence reports. So you think he's hiding in the Arbat district? I think he's using resources he developed there. Personal relationships, local knowledge, maybe even a safe house that's not connected to the embassy or any official CIA operations. Another pattern emerged from the reports. Chen had been purchasing books from a specific bookstore in the Arbat district. Old academic texts on economics and trade policy. For a trade attaché, this would seem natural. But the frequency of his visits and the specific books he was buying suggested something more. Bookstores, I said. Classic intelligence tradecraft. The owner, Nina Volkov, runs an antiquarian bookshop that specializes in academic texts. Chen wasn't just buying books. He was building a relationship with someone who could provide him with identity documents, safe passage, or temporary shelter. Coleman nodded slowly. So our extraction plan focuses on the Arbat district. Not yet. First, we need to confirm he's alive and accessible. And we need to understand why he hasn't tried to contact us through any official channels. I studied the timeline of events leading up to Chen's disappearance. The arrest of Blackbird 3 days ago, the increased FSB surveillance, and the aborted meeting at Café Pushkin suggested a coordinated Russian operation to roll up Western intelligence networks in Moscow. There's something bigger happening here, I said. The Russians didn't just compromise one asset. They've been running a comprehensive counterintelligence operation. Chen might be avoiding contact because he knows the entire network is blown. Coleman leaned back in her chair. So how do we get him out? Carefully. We can't use official channels. And we can't rely on any resources that might be compromised. We need to think like Chen, like someone who's operating completely off the grid in hostile territory. Agent Martinez had been quietly monitoring communication channels while we talked. Suddenly, she looked up with an expression of urgency. Director Coleman, we're receiving priority communication from Moscow station. They're reporting unusual activity at the embassy, increased Russian surveillance, possible preparation for a diplomatic incident. Coleman's face tightened. What kind of diplomatic incident? Unknown, but the station chief believes the Russians are building a case for public accusations of espionage. They might be preparing to arrest embassy personnel or declare diplomats persona non grata. The pieces were falling into place. The Russians had rolled up intelligence networks, compromised assets, and were now preparing to create a public crisis that would damage American intelligence operations throughout the region. David isn't just missing, I said. He's the key to whatever the Russians are planning. If they can prove he was operating under diplomatic cover, they can justify a massive expulsion of American intelligence personnel. Coleman stood up. Then we need to get him out before that happens. Yes, but not through official channels. If we try to extract him using embassy resources, we'll be playing into their hands. We need to get him out the way he would get himself out, using his personal network, his training, and resources the Russians don't know about. I looked at the map of Moscow one more time, tracing the routes between Chen's known locations and the Arbat district. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings, a highly trained intelligence officer was hiding, waiting for rescue or preparing for capture. How long do we have? I asked. Coleman checked her watch. If the Russians are preparing a diplomatic incident, probably not long, maybe 48 hours before they make their move. Then we better hope David is as good at staying hidden as I taught him to be. The secure communication room buzzed with activity as teams across multiple time zones coordinated what had become a race against time. While Moscow slept, Washington was mobilizing resources for an extraction operation that couldn't officially exist. We've got movement, Agent Martinez announced, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. Satellite imagery shows unusual activity around the Lubyanka building. Multiple vehicles, personnel changes, and what appears to be preparation for a major operation. The Lubyanka FSB headquarters and the most feared address in Moscow. If the Russians were ramping up operations there, it meant they were preparing for something significant. I studied the latest intelligence reports spread across 3 monitors. Financial records showed Chen had made several small cash withdrawals from different ATMs across Moscow in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The pattern was deliberate, never more than the equivalent of $50, always from machines in busy commercial areas, always at different times of day. He was building an emergency fund, I explained to Coleman. Small amounts, untraceable, distributed across multiple locations. Classic preparation for going underground. But there was something else in the financial data that caught my attention. 3 days before his disappearance, Chen had made a purchase at a medical supply store in the Arbat district. The receipt showed bandages, antiseptic, and basic first aid supplies, far more than someone would need for routine purposes. He was expecting trouble, I said. This wasn't a routine intelligence gathering operation that went wrong. David knew something was about to happen. Coleman studied the receipt. What kind of trouble? The kind that might require emergency medical treatment. He was preparing for the possibility of being injured during an escape or while in hiding. Agent Martinez had been monitoring Russian communication channels when she suddenly straightened. Director, we're intercepting increased FSB radio traffic. They're discussing a, quote, Christmas morning operation involving what they're calling, quote, diplomatic fish. The room fell silent. In intelligence parlance, fish often referred to assets or targets, and the timing suggested the Russians were planning something for Christmas Day, less than 6 hours away. They're going to move against the embassy, I said. Christmas morning, when most of the staff is either sleeping or attending holiday services. Minimal security presence, maximum media impact. Coleman was already reaching for her secure phone. I need to contact the ambassador and the station chief. If the Russians are planning to raid the embassy... Wait, I interrupted. If we alert embassy security, and they change their protocols, the Russians will know we've intercepted their communications. We'll lose our intelligence advantage. So we just let them raid the embassy? We use their operation as cover for our own. While they're focused on the embassy, we extract Chen through his personal network. I pulled up a detailed map of Moscow's Arbat district on the main screen. The area was a maze of narrow streets, historic buildings, and small businesses. Perfect terrain for someone trying to remain hidden. "The bookstore," I said, pointing to a location 3 blocks from the chess club. Nina Volkov's antiquarian bookshop. If Chen established a personal relationship with her, that's where he would go for help. "Based on what evidence?" Coleman asked. "Based on how I trained him. When operating in hostile territory, you build relationships with people who have 3 key qualities: access to resources, reason to distrust authorities, and personal motivation to help you." I accessed Chen's psychological profile and cross-referenced it with his operational history. During his training, he'd shown exceptional ability to read people and build trust quickly. His language skills included fluent Russian, which he'd learned from his grandmother, who'd emigrated from St. Petersburg in the 1960s. "Nina Volkov is perfect," I continued. "She runs an independent bookstore that specializes in academic texts, the kind of business that operates on thin margins and has complicated relationships with government regulators. She's in her 60s, educated, and according to Moscow business records, her shop has been raided twice by tax authorities in the past year." Coleman nodded slowly. "So she has reason to distrust the government." And David would have presented himself as someone who appreciates Russian literature and culture. He would have bought books regularly, engaged her in conversations about history and politics, and gradually built a relationship based on mutual respect rather than transactional necessity. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer. Chen had spent months building a personal support network that existed completely outside official channels. The chess club provided social connections and local knowledge. The bookstore offered potential shelter and resources. The medical supplies suggested he'd been preparing for the possibility of having to go underground. He's been planning this for months, I realized. David didn't just detect surveillance at the cafe. He's been expecting his cover to be blown. He's been preparing for exactly this scenario. Agent Martinez looked up from her communications equipment. "We're receiving a priority message from the NSA. They've been monitoring Russian diplomatic communications, and there's chatter about a, quote, significant intelligence victory being announced on Christmas morning." The implications were chilling. The Russians weren't just planning to raid the embassy. They were preparing to publicly expose American intelligence operations in Moscow. Chen's capture would be the centerpiece of their propaganda victory. "How do we contact him?" Coleman asked. "We don't. He'll contact us when he's ready, using methods that only he and I know about." I explained the emergency communication protocol I'd taught Chen during his training. It involved a series of seemingly random actions that would create a pattern visible only to someone who knew what to look for. "David will leave coded messages in public places, graffiti, newspaper advertisements, even social media posts. The key is knowing where to look and how to interpret what seems like random information." I had Agent Martinez begin monitoring Moscow's local internet forums, classified advertisement websites, and social media platforms for specific patterns. We were looking for references to chess moves, book titles, or mathematical sequences that might contain hidden meanings. "There," I said, pointing to a post on a Moscow chess forum. Someone posted a discussion about a chess problem involving a trapped knight. The position described matches a training exercise I used to teach emergency extraction protocols. The post had been made 2 hours earlier from an internet cafe in the Arbat district. The username was Tradewind47, a reference to Chen's cover identity and the year he'd graduated from college. "He's alive, he's in the Arbat district, and he's ready to be extracted," I announced. "But he's also telling us he's trapped and needs help." Coleman leaned forward. "What kind of help?" "Transportation, secure communication, and a way to get past FSB surveillance. He's holed up somewhere safe, but he can't move without assistance." The coded message contained additional information hidden in the chess notation. Chen was indicating he had valuable intelligence about the Russian operation, information that needed to reach Washington before the Christmas morning raids. He's not just trying to escape, I realized. He's trying to complete his mission. He has intelligence that could prevent the Russians from achieving their objectives. Agent Martinez had been monitoring Russian communications when she suddenly turned pale. "Director, we're intercepting FSB communications about American embassy personnel. They're discussing arrest warrants for multiple diplomats, including the ambassador. The scope of the Russian operation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about rolling up intelligence networks. It was about creating a diplomatic crisis that would damage American-Russian relations for years to come. "We need to move fast," Coleman said. "How do we get an extraction team to Moscow?" "We don't. Official extraction teams would be detected before they could reach Chen. We need to use local resources and personal contacts." I pulled up a list of American citizens living in Moscow, business people, journalists, and cultural exchange participants who might be able to provide assistance without arousing suspicion. "Kaifir, there," I said, pointing to a name on the list. "Rebecca Thompson, cultural attaché at the American Cultural Center. She's been in Moscow for 3 years, speaks fluent Russian, and according to her background check, she has no official connection to intelligence operations." "Can we trust her?" "We have to. She's our best option for someone who can move freely through Moscow without triggering FSB surveillance." I drafted a carefully worded message that would appear to be a routine cultural exchange inquiry, but would actually contain instructions for contacting Chen. The message would be sent through official diplomatic channels, making it appear completely legitimate. "What about extraction?" Coleman asked. "We use the Russians' own operation against them. While they're focused on raiding the embassy, we move Chen through the city using routes and methods they won't expect." I outlined a plan that would rely on Chen's personal network and the chaos of the Christmas morning raids. Nina Volkov's bookstore would serve as a staging area, while the chess club members would provide transportation and safe passage through the city. "This is incredibly risky," Coleman said. "If something goes wrong, we'll have an intelligence officer captured or killed in Moscow, and no official way to explain his presence there. If we don't try, we'll lose Chen and the intelligence he's carrying. And the Russians will score a major propaganda victory that will damage American intelligence operations worldwide." Agent Martinez interrupted our planning session. "Director, we're receiving another communication from Moscow. The embassy is reporting increased surveillance and what appears to be preparation for a major security operation." Time was running out. In 6 hours, the Russians would launch their Christmas morning operation. If we were going to extract Chen, we had to act now. "Send the message to Rebecca Thompson," I told Coleman, "and pray that David is as good at staying hidden as I taught him to be." As the secure communication went out to Moscow, I realized I was betting everything on the training I'd given Chen years ago. His survival, the success of the mission, and potentially the careers of everyone in the room depended on whether a former student could execute lessons learned in a Virginia training facility while hiding from the FSB in the heart of Moscow. The next few hours would determine whether my decision to return to the CIA would save an agent's life or cost American intelligence its most valuable asset in Russia. Rebecca Thompson received the message at 3:47 a.m. Moscow time while reviewing cultural exchange proposals in her apartment near Patriarch's Ponds. The seemingly routine inquiry about Russian literature exhibitions contained phrases that made her blood run cold, phrases that activated training she'd hoped never to use. She wasn't just a cultural attaché. 3 years earlier, Rebecca had been recruited by the CIA as a NOC, an officer operating under non-official cover. Her job was to blend into Moscow's cultural community while gathering intelligence on Russian educational and cultural policies. She'd never expected to be activated for an operational mission. The coded message was clear: locate and assist an American in the Arbat district who would identify himself with a specific phrase about Pushkin's poetry. Provide transportation and communication support. Exercise extreme caution. Hostile surveillance likely. Rebecca dressed in layers appropriate for Moscow's December weather and left her apartment building through the service entrance. Her 3 years in the city had taught her the patterns of FSB surveillance, and she knew how to move through Moscow without attracting attention. Meanwhile, in a storage room behind Nina Volkov's bookstore, David Chen was fighting exhaustion and infection from a knife wound he'd sustained while escaping FSB surveillance 2 days earlier. The cut on his arm wasn't deep, but without proper medical attention, it was becoming infected. Nina had found him collapsed in the alley behind her store on Christmas Eve morning. His story about being mugged while walking home from a late dinner was obviously fabricated, but something in his eyes had convinced her to help. Perhaps it was his fluent Russian, spoken with the same St. Petersburg accent her late husband had possessed. Or perhaps it was the way he'd immediately offered to pay for any trouble he might cause. "You need to see a doctor," Nina said, checking his bandages for the third time that morning. "No doctors," Chen replied firmly. "Too many questions. Too much paperwork." "It's getting better." It wasn't getting better, and they both knew it. Chen's fever had been rising steadily, and he was having difficulty concentrating. The intelligence he carried, details about Russian plans to compromise Western diplomatic personnel across Eastern Europe, was too important to lose because of a simple infection. Nina studied him with the sharp eyes of someone who'd survived decades of Soviet bureaucracy and post-Soviet chaos. "You're not really a trade attaché, are you?" Chen met her gaze. After 2 days of fever and pain, he was too tired for elaborate deceptions. "No, I'm not." "I thought so." Trade attachés don't usually speak Russian like natives of St. Petersburg, and they don't carry first aid supplies designed for knife wounds. "Are you going to turn me in?" Nina laughed, a sound filled with years of bitterness toward authority. "Turn you in to whom?" "The same people who've been harassing my business for years? The same officials who arrested my nephew for posting political jokes online?" Chen felt a wave of relief mixed with gratitude. His training had been correct. Sometimes the best allies were found among people who had their own reasons to distrust the government. "What do you need?" Nina asked. "A way to contact my people without using phones or internet connections that can be traced, and eventually a way to get out of Moscow." Nina considered this. "The first part might be possible. I have a customer who works at the Central Telegraph Office. Old Soviet technology. But it still works, and it's not monitored as closely as modern communications." At Langley, Agent Martinez had been monitoring Moscow communications when she detected an unusual pattern in telegraph traffic. Someone was transmitting what appeared to be business communications, but the language patterns and timing suggested coded intelligence. "Sarah, look at this," Martinez called out. "We're receiving what might be communication from Chen." I studied the telegraph message. It appeared to be a routine inquiry about rare book availability, but embedded in the text were chess moves that corresponded to intelligence about Russian operational plans. "He's alive and he has the intelligence," I announced to Coleman, "but he's also indicating that he's injured and needs medical attention." The coded message contained details that made everyone in the operations center sit up. Chen had discovered that the Russian operation wasn't limited to Moscow. It was a coordinated effort to compromise Western intelligence networks across multiple Eastern European capitals. The Christmas morning raids were just the beginning. "He's uncovered a continent-wide counterintelligence operation," I said, decoding the chess notation. "The Russians have been planning this for months. They're going to simultaneously expose and arrest Western intelligence officers in Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, and Bucharest." Coleman immediately activated secure communications with CIA stations across Eastern Europe. Within minutes, alert messages were going out to American intelligence personnel throughout the region. "We need to get Chen out now," Coleman said. "If he has this level of intelligence, the Russians will tear Moscow apart looking for him." I studied the latest satellite imagery of the Arbat district. FSB vehicles were positioned at major intersections, and foot patrols were systematically searching buildings. The net was tightening around Chen's location. "Rebecca Thompson needs to move fast," I said. "The Russians are starting a block-by-block search." Rebecca had reached the Arbat district and was using her cultural attaché credentials to move through the area. Her cover story, researching locations for a literary walking tour, gave her legitimate reasons to visit bookstores and cultural sites. She found Nina's bookstore just as FSB officers were questioning the shop owner 3 doors down. The systematic search was moving toward Nina's location, and they had perhaps 30 minutes before the authorities reached the bookstore. Rebecca entered the shop and approached Nina with carefully rehearsed words. "I'm looking for first editions of Pushkin's poetry, particularly The Bronze Horseman." Nina's eyes widened slightly. It was the phrase Chen had told her to listen for. "Follow me," she said quietly. "The rare books are in the back." Nina led Rebecca through the store to the storage room where Chen was hiding. His condition was worse than Rebecca had expected: fever, obvious infection, and signs of dehydration. He was conscious but clearly struggling. "We need to move him now," Rebecca said. "The FSB is 3 buildings away and heading this direction." "He can barely walk," Nina protested. Rebecca assessed their options. Chen needed immediate medical attention, but getting him to a hospital would expose him to FSB surveillance. However, she knew of a private clinic in another district where the doctor owed favors to American cultural programs. "I have a car 2 blocks away," Rebecca said. "If we can get him there, I know someone who can treat his infection discreetly." Nina had been thinking about escape routes during the 2 days Chen had been hiding in her store. There's a service tunnel that connects to the building next door. It was built during Soviet times for emergency evacuations. We can use it to avoid the street. As they prepared to move Chen, Nina made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'm coming with you." "Nina, this isn't your fight," Chen said weakly. "It became my fight when I decided to help you," she replied firmly. "Besides, if the FSB finds evidence that I've been hiding someone, I'll be arrested anyway. Better to disappear completely than face interrogation at Lubyanka." Rebecca realized Nina was right. The bookstore owner's life in Moscow was over the moment she'd decided to help Chen. Leaving her behind would be a death sentence. "Can you reach your contact at the telegraph office?" Rebecca asked Nina. "Yes, why?" "We need to send one more message to let our people know we're moving. After that, we go completely dark until we're out of the country." Nina made a quick phone call to her contact, transmitting a final coded message that would reach Langley within hours. The message contained coordinates for an emergency extraction point outside Moscow and confirmation that Chen's intelligence about the multi-country operation was accurate. At Langley, I received the final message with a mixture of relief and concern. Chen was alive and moving, but the extraction was far from guaranteed. The Russians had closed most routes out of Moscow, and FSB surveillance was being coordinated from the highest levels. "They're heading for Extraction Point Delta," I told Coleman. "It's a private airfield about 60 kilometers outside Moscow, but they'll have to travel through multiple FSB checkpoints to reach it." Coleman studied the route on the tactical display. "What are their chances?" "Better than if they stayed in the city," I replied. "But the next 12 hours will determine whether this mission succeeds or becomes an international incident." Agent Martinez had been monitoring Russian communications when she looked up with alarm. "Director, we're intercepting FSB communications about the bookstore. They found evidence of recent occupation and they're expanding the search perimeter." The race was on. Chen, Rebecca, and Nina had perhaps a 4-hour head start before the FSB realized their quarry had escaped the Arbat district. In that time, they needed to reach the extraction point, evade multiple security checkpoints, and somehow get Chen medical attention before his condition became critical. "Sarah," Coleman said quietly, "I hope your training was as good as you think it was." I stared at the tactical display, watching as red markers representing FSB units spread across Moscow like a closing net. Somewhere in that maze of surveillance and danger, 3 people were risking everything to bring critical intelligence back to America. "So do I replied. "So do I." The service tunnel beneath Nina's bookstore hadn't been used in decades. Cobwebs brushed against their faces as Rebecca helped Chen navigate the cramped concrete passage, while Nina followed behind, carrying a bag of emergency supplies and the last photographs from her destroyed life. Chen's fever was worsening, but adrenaline kept him moving through the underground maze that connected several Soviet-era buildings. His training kicked in despite his weakened state. Check corners, listen for pursuit, maintain operational security even when every step felt like walking through quicksand. They emerged in the basement of an abandoned office building, 3 blocks from the bookstore. Through grimy windows, they could see FSB vehicles surrounding Nina's neighborhood, officers with dogs beginning a systematic search of every building. "My car is parked near the Arbatskaya metro station," Rebecca whispered. "We need to move during the shift change at the security checkpoint." Rebecca had chosen her vehicle carefully during her 3 years in Moscow, a 10-year-old Lada that looked like thousands of others on the city's streets. More importantly, it was registered under her legitimate cultural attaché credentials and had never been used for anything that would attract FSB attention. The journey through Moscow's early morning streets required nerves of steel. Christmas Day traffic was light, but that made their vehicle more conspicuous. Rebecca drove with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single traffic violation could end everything. Chen lay across the back seat, covered by Nina's coat, fighting waves of delirium from his infection. The intelligence he carried about the multi-country Russian operation felt like it was burning a hole in his memory. Names, dates, operational details. If he lost consciousness, years of intelligence work across Eastern Europe would be compromised. "Nina," he whispered, "I need you to memorize something." Despite her fear, Nina listened as Chen recited a series of numbers and code names. She'd spent decades memorizing poetry and literature, Russian cultural heritage that had sustained her through the Soviet years and the chaos that followed. Now she applied those same skills to intelligence that could prevent an international crisis. At Langley, I was coordinating with CIA stations across Eastern Europe as reports flooded in. Chen's intelligence was proving accurate. Russian counterintelligence operations were indeed being launched simultaneously in multiple capitals. Prague station reports unusual FSB activity near the embassy, Agent Martinez announced. Warsaw and Budapest are seeing similar patterns. Director Coleman was managing a crisis that spanned continents. How long before our people are clear? Most have been warned and are following emergency protocols, I replied, but we have 3 officers in Budapest who haven't responded to communications. The scope of the Russian operation was breathtaking. They'd been planning this for at least 18 months, carefully mapping Western intelligence networks and preparing to dismantle them in a single coordinated strike. Only Chen's discovery and escape had prevented complete surprise. Meanwhile, Rebecca's Lada was approaching the first FSB checkpoint on the highway leading out of Moscow. Her hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but her heart was racing. Everything depended on whether their false documentation would pass inspection. The FSB officer who approached their vehicle was young, probably new to checkpoint duty on Christmas morning. Rebecca handed over her diplomatic passport and identification for Nina, who was posing as her Russian interpreter for a cultural research project. "Where are you traveling on Christmas morning?" the officer asked suspiciously. "Sergiev Posad," Rebecca replied calmly. "I'm researching historical monasteries for an upcoming cultural exhibition. My interpreter arranged for us to photograph the Trinity Lavra before the Christmas services begin." Pagafni Ikweviz. The monastery at Sergiev Posad was indeed a logical destination for a cultural attaché, and Christmas morning was exactly when such photography would be possible without crowds. The cover story was perfect because it was almost true. Rebecca had visited the monastery multiple times for legitimate cultural research. The officer examined their documents while another guard walked around the vehicle. Chen remained motionless under Nina's coat, controlling his breathing despite the fever that made every muscle ache. "Your interpreter seems unwell," the first officer observed, noting Nina's obvious nervousness. "Car sickness," Rebecca said with a slight smile. "She's not comfortable traveling on highways." After what felt like hours but was probably less than 5 minutes, the officer returned their documents. "Drive carefully. The roads are icy." As they pulled away from the checkpoint, Nina began quietly crying. Tears of relief mixed with grief for the life she was leaving behind. Chen squeezed her hand weakly, understanding that her sacrifice was making their escape possible. The private airfield where extraction had been arranged was owned by a Russian businessman with complex relationships to Western companies. The airstrip served corporate jets and wealthy individuals who valued discretion over official oversight. Most importantly, flights could be arranged without extensive government documentation. Rebecca's CIA contact had arranged for a medical evacuation flight disguised as corporate transportation for an American businessman who'd suffered a heart attack while visiting Moscow. The cover story would explain both the urgency and the medical equipment aboard the aircraft. As they drove through the Russian countryside, Chen's condition continued to deteriorate. The infection was spreading despite Nina's attempts to clean and rebandage his wound. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in English, sometimes in Russian, occasionally mumbling operational details that made Rebecca realize how much classified information was locked in his feverish mind. "Stay with us, David," she whispered. "We're almost there." At Langley, Tension filled the operations center as we tracked the progress of extractions across Eastern Europe. Most American intelligence personnel had successfully evaded Russian operations, but the situation remained fluid. "Sarah," Director Coleman said quietly, "I want you to know that regardless of how this ends, your decision to help has saved dozens of American intelligence officers across the region." I appreciated the sentiment, but my focus remained on the tactical display showing Rebecca's projected route toward the extraction point. They were still 40 kilometers from safety, and Russian security forces were expanding their search perimeter. "They're not safe yet," I replied, "and neither are we. If the Russians realize the scope of what we've uncovered, they'll escalate this into a full diplomatic crisis." Agent Martinez looked up from her communications equipment. "Director, we're receiving reports of increased Russian military activity near their borders with NATO countries. This might be bigger than just counterintelligence." The implications were staggering. If the Russians were using their intelligence operations as pretext for broader military posturing, the stakes were far higher than anyone had realized. Rebecca's Lada finally reached the private airfield as dawn broke over the Moscow countryside. The facility was small: a single runway, a modest terminal building, and several hangars housing private aircraft. Most importantly, it was far enough from major population centers to operate with minimal official oversight. The medical evacuation aircraft was waiting, its engines already warming up. Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation to our communications specialist, was a former military surgeon who now provided discreet medical services for corporate clients with complicated international situations. Getting Chen aboard the aircraft required careful coordination. He was barely conscious, running a dangerous fever, and needed immediate intravenous antibiotics. Dr. Martinez had prepared a mobile medical unit that could provide intensive care during the flight to a NATO medical facility in Germany. Nina stood on the tarmac, watching as medical personnel transferred Chen to the aircraft. She'd made her choice to leave Russia, but the reality of permanent exile was beginning to sink in. Everything she'd known, her bookstore, her neighborhood, her entire life, was gone forever. "Nina," Rebecca said gently, "you saved his life. You saved all of us." "I know," Nina replied quietly, "but knowing something is right doesn't always make it easy." As the aircraft prepared for departure, I received final confirmation at Langley that Chen was aboard and receiving medical attention. The intelligence he carried had already prevented a massive compromise of Western operations across Eastern Europe. "Sarah," Director Coleman said, "I have a question for you." "Yes, Director?" "I know you came back to help with this crisis, but I'm hoping you'll consider staying. The agency needs officers with your experience and instincts." I looked around the operations center, the controlled chaos of global intelligence work, the dedicated professionals who spent their holidays protecting American interests, the sense of purpose that came from work that truly mattered. 3 years ago, I'd walked away from this life because my family couldn't accept my career choices. Now I realize that some callings transcend family approval or social expectations. "I'll need to think about it," I said, though we both knew I'd already decided. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it, expecting another operational update, but instead saw a message from my mother. "Sarah, we saw the news about diplomatic incidents in Russia. We hope you're safe. Love, Mom and Dad." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't acceptance of my career, but it was acknowledgement that my work mattered, even if they didn't fully understand it. The aircraft carrying Chen, Nina, and Rebecca lifted off from the Russian airfield just as FSB units arrived at the facility. They were 30 minutes too late. The extraction had succeeded, the intelligence was secure, and 3 lives had been saved. As Christmas morning broke over Virginia, I stood in the CIA Operations Center, surrounded by colleagues who understood the significance of what we'd accomplished. We'd prevented an international crisis, saved American intelligence networks across multiple countries, and brought home an officer who'd risked everything for his country. My parents would never fully understand my choice to return to this life. Uncle Robert would continue to disapprove of my profession. But standing in that room, watching the successful conclusion of an operation that had started with a phone call on Christmas Eve, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. Some families are chosen rather than born. Some callings matter more than social approval. And sometimes, the most important work happens when the rest of the world is celebrating with the people they love. Director Coleman approached me as the operations center began to return to normal staffing levels. "So Sarah, what's your decision?" I thought about my empty apartment, my parents who would never fully accept my choices, and the work that had given my life meaning and purpose. "When do I start?" I asked. "You already have," she replied with a smile. "Welcome back to the CIA, Deputy Director Williams." As I walked out of Langley into the Christmas morning sunlight, I realized that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in crisis, opportunity, and the chance to discover that you're stronger than you thought possible. My phone rang again. This time, it was Chen, calling from a German medical facility where he was recovering from surgery. "Sarah," his voice was weak but clear, "thank you for not giving up on me." "Thank you for remembering everything I taught you," I replied. "Merry Christmas, David." "Merry Christmas, Deputy Director." I ended the call and headed home to my apartment, which no longer felt empty but simply quiet. Tomorrow, I would start rebuilding a career I'd thought was over. Tonight, I would rest knowing that sometimes the most important family dinners are the ones you miss in order to save lives that matter. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.